some of what he said there I find absolutely extraordinary. He talked about the levels of trust in the BBC. It said it's not for the BBC to pursue and find out whether the presenter has been in touch with the person at the centre of these allegations. I would argue it absolutely is right to ask that question. She also pursued him on whether that presenter had supplied financial assistance for a legal representative. He said that is not for the BBC either. I would argue it absolutely is. He also said that protocol suggested that speaking to the presenter only last Thursday was right. No, he's wrong. It cannot take 7 weeks. I can understand initially when a complaint comes in, you might want to find your way around it first and see what's going on. To wait 7 weeks to speak to the main person involved in what are potentially criminal allegations is absolutely wrong on every single level. I've no idea how anybody would defend that in any other way. Nick Dubois is still with us. What did you make of that, Nick? I mean, he's a very calm man. He was up against it a little bit with some of those questions, but I thought some of his answers were extraordinary.
I think it was a very blancmange, dull, unconvincing response. But worst of all, I think it was riddled with inconsistencies. So take, for example, the praise he showered on his corporate investigations team at the beginning, where incidentally he said they're looking at something like 250 complaints. And yet he tried to argue that this was such a serious offence that they followed protocol looking after it, but then to only try and make 2 attempts to follow up on it in 7 weeks doesn't tell me that you've got a good corporate investigations team. One
email and 1 phone call. I mean, that would not stand up anywhere.
Inadequate. That is not a good corporate investigations team. That fuels the idea that the BBC are more interested in covering things up rather than exposing where there may or may not have been wrongdoing. I think that was so complacent on that alone. He should be considering his position, because he himself then uttered those words: we should never, ever have to hear from the BBC again, given their history of scandals of this ilk. There are lessons to be learned.
Yes.
I mean, how much slack must we give to an organisation that is clearly riddled with problems of these makings, that we continue to have lessons learned? If they had learnt any lessons, they would have been all over this at an early stage, regardless of whether it was criminality or so serious that it warranted the attention of their corporation, their corporate investigations department.
And then into a sort of curious mini rant about how many parts of the world don't have a free press, and he talked about the strong levels of trust in the BBC.
Yeah, and this, I thought, again, this is what I meant by blancmange. It was corporate speak talking about, isn't it wonderful we have a free press, when it's quite clear that the news organisation that had this, let's call it a story, for 7 weeks, were clearly not going to be encouraging their press to look into it. And it took the Sun to bring it into the public domain. Now, look, we don't know. The truth of the matter is none of us really know what's gone on here and what hasn't gone on here. But to argue in defence that there should be trust in the BBC because they are operating in a culture and environment and a nation that still prides free speech, I think just shows how weak their defence is.
And to go back to that initial point that you made, Nick, I mean, based on Mr. Davie's own evidence here, there is something talked about protocols were followed. Well, clearly the protocols are not fit for purpose. If you were contacting somebody who has made such serious allegations about an extremely high-profile figure within your corporation, and you made only 1 email attempt and 1 phone call attempt, then there is something rotten about your protocols.
And this comes after a legacy of scandals of this ilk. And that is what is so worrying, which is why people like me and many people who I know who watch and listen to you, Ian, have a huge skepticism that the BBC is ultimately fit for purpose. Because, you know, how many times must we hear these depressing words? We hear it from two types about lessons learned. We hear it from politicians. That drives us crazy. And we hear it from the BBC. And you know, particularly in something like this, when you've got potential victims here to continue learning these lessons, which they are clearly not. Otherwise, their protocols would have been downside better than we are hearing about. And just a final point, and you calmed me when you addressed this yourself. The idea that the Director General, who has known all along he would be public facing today, because this appearance they had, their annual review of the BBC, is something that is in the diary a year ahead. He actually did not speak to whoever this presenter is. I find staggering. Yeah. That is corporate complacency at its worst.
Indeed. Listen, Nick, very thorough response. Thank you. Nick Dubois, former Conservative MP, of course. He's with us here regularly on talkTV as well. And that other aspect that I just thought was an extraordinary response from the Director General when he was asked. It was a very reasonable question, and here is the BBC doing that thing that they do from time to time, partly based on previous failures, trying to show that they're up front. Don't worry, we're reporting it on ourselves. There was Fiona yesterday at the 6 o'clock news gong. Straight away, new evidence about the BBC. We're under investigation. The police are looking at this. And yet when it comes to the main man giving answers, the question about whether the presenter concerned had spoken to who would be, one assumes, the chief witness, the young man in this case, then nothing at all. Absolutely. No, that's not for the BBC, he said. That's not for the BBC. Or to establish whether the presenter concerned had had any kind of conversation with the chief witness in this investigation, and perhaps more pressingly, whether they had in any way funded a lawyer for that chief witness, given that the legal firm that this young person has utilised is one of the most expensive in the land. And that fact was again raised yesterday on the 6 o'clock news on the BBC. And yet when it was put to the Director General, well, that's not really anything to do with us. Let's go live to Broadcasting House. Oliver Whitfield-Mirchich, our reporter, is there. So we've had the Tim Davie appearance on The World at One there, Tim. We didn't get too much from that. I would suggest it was a very corporate affair on his behalf. Prior to that, of course, he'd given that Zoom meeting where questions all related to this pretty much dominated.
Yeah, that's right. And the BBC put conditions on that Zoom meeting that we were not allowed to record it or to pass on any recordings from it. The BBC also giving the Director General once again to another BBC outlet. talkTV has approached the BBC on a number of occasions over the past 48 hours asking for our own sit-down interview with the Director General. However, so far, those requests have been turned down. But during that latest clip that we just heard there on Radio 4, we heard the Director General right at the top saying that this was a very difficult balancing act for the BBC. It's looking at a serious complaint, which at the time when it first came in was judged as serious but something which wasn't criminal, and that the BBC is trying to do a great balancing act between protecting the rights of privacy for those who are involved, whilst also taking care of safeguarding, while also trying to run an HR process. I thought what was really interesting was when the Director General was asked about the only 2 attempts that were made to try to contact the complainants. Now remember, this is the parents of the young person who had spoken to the Sun. Now, on that, Mr Davie said, I think it's a fair question, and he raised 2 points. Does the BBC raise red flags quick enough? And also questions about the processes and how those may change. He says that work will start straight away. Another quite interesting point was where he was asked if there were any other complaints made against this same presenter. Now, this is a question that we heard earlier on in that Zoom interview, and the answers were exactly the same, that it would not be right yet to comment. So at the moment, the BBC is trying to show that it is doing the best job possible when it comes to this investigation, an investigation which has had to be paused at the request of the Metropolitan Police while they make their own inquiries to see if they're going to launch a formal investigation of their own. Some more details have been given. We've now got that timeline, but there are still quite a few questions facing the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Indeed, Oliver, we have. And in terms of the Met Police, we know that they haven't... It's not an official investigation. They're following up leads. Is that roughly what they're telling us?
So they are carrying out inquiries to establish whether there will be any further investigation in due course. So I imagine the dossier which was handed over to the BBC, the Sun's got information as well. All of that information, the phone recording that we heard on that initial phone recording that was made back in May from the complainants, which runs to 29 minutes long. You can imagine the BBC now having to hand over all of that information to the police. They will go through it, and then it'll be for them to assess whether there is enough grounds to launch a formal investigation to see if any criminal act might have occurred. But at the moment, it seems that all of the action has been transferred over to the Metropolitan Police.
Ollie, thank you. Oliver Whitfield-Mircic